Hello there, welcome to my build of the Revell Humber Mark II Scout car. I've been out of scale modelling for almost 30 years and just recently I was forced to take early medical retirement and I decided to get back into it, but not having built a model for nearly 30 years meant that I was very much out of practice. So before I started building expensive kits like Tamiya and Hasegawa and trumpeter kits, I thought I'd start with some very basic, cheap, small kits just to get some practice in. This kit was purchased for me by a friend from my Amazon wishlist, so I thought I'd give it a go. Now this model build video is a bit different to other model build videos because, well, I make cock-ups. I make loads of cock-ups. My builds are not perfect and I show them everything, warts and all, so you get to see all my mistakes as well as the finished build in the hope that maybe you don't make the same mistake. So that's where I'm different to other videos. I've also sped it up so it's running at 10 times normal speed because there's around about 35 hours of video footage that I had to edit down to make this build video. Anyway, let's get on with the build and I'll talk you through bits of it as we go along. The first thing I always like to do whenever I'm building a new kit is I open up the box and I check that everything's there. I check it against the instructions and I check that the sprue is all complete and there's nothing missing and there's no damaged parts and anything else. And I normally check it a couple of times just to make sure. Once I'm happy everything's there, I'm ready to get going. And I always follow the instructions after reading them thoroughly. And the first thing I do is I start cutting the bits off with a sprue. Now, what I've learned from past experience is you cut them off and you actually check that they fit. Check which round they fit. Check that you know how they fit before you attempt to cement them. Don't just go in and attempt to cement them because you'll get it wrong. Check and check again. Cement I'm using here is Tamiya extra thin cement. It's one of my favourites. I actually quite like Tamiya cements. They do two that I use. A regular thick cement and an extra thin cement. The extra thin cement is good for precision joining. That's not the only cement I use. I use two other cements. I use Revell Precision Poly, which is the one that comes with the little metal tube poking out of it. That's the one that I use the most because I can get a real precision thing in there. I also use something called MEK, which I'll talk about a bit later on in this video. Even though I'm not doing it in this video, my advice is while you're doing this, wear rubber gloves, well, polyurethane gloves, you know, surgeon's gloves. The reason I'm not wearing gloves is very simple. I have an incurable cancer and I'm currently undergoing chemotherapy. And one of the problems with the chemotherapy is it's left me with a bit of nerve damage in the tips of my fingers. The very tips of my fingers are quite numb. And I can't feel anything when I've got rubber gloves on, so I'm not wearing them. The reason I advise wearing them is when you're working with cement, especially the thicker cements, if you get any on your finger, you can transfer the fingerprint onto parts of the model that you don't want them to. Like, for instance, I'm putting on the wheel arches here, and if my finger accidentally touched the cement and then I touched the wheel arch, it would leave a fingerprint on the wheel arch. But with the gloves, it still leaves a mark, but it's much cleaner. There's no ridges and whorls. So that's why I'd recommend wearing gloves. You've just seen me use a sanding stick here. Now, sanding sticks to me are an essential part of any modeller's kit. They come in all different grades and they're essential, especially with smaller parts that don't come away from the sprue cleanly and leave a little bit of a burr, which is what I've just sanded off there. I cannot reiterate strongly enough about checking and double checking a part before you cement it. Even though I've checked this part nearly 3 times, I still nearly cemented it the wrong way round, and I'm glad I did that last final check before I cemented it. Again, more sanding to do. I like Revell kits, but I do find that they're not that good on the sprue. Revell and Airfix are two kits that I find myself having to do a lot of sanding on, so I keep all grades of sanding sticks handy for this very reason. Once again, the advice as always is to check, double check and treble check the instructions before you cut a part off, which is why you'll constantly see me referring back to the instruction sheets. Even though I think I'm a fairly experienced modeller, it really does pay to keep checking and double checking, because if you make a mistake early on, sometimes you won't even notice it until the very end, and that can actually spoil a model for you. So again, check and double check. This kit is basically in two parts that you're building. You're building the what you call the body, and then you're building the turret with the man inside. And I built them as two separate parts. I could put them together at this stage, but I'm not going to, because I want to spray them separately, because otherwise, once I put them together, I won't be able to get the paint under the turret to the points I need it, because the turret will rotate and the guns will elevate. And I want to get the paint in there so that when you rotate it and you elevate it, there's no paint missing. And if you put the turret on now, you'll find that you can't spray it accurately. So I'm doing them as two separate sections. At this point here, I better give you a little bit of a warning. The guns go into the turret and they're held behind with a little round bit. And what you do is you put the guns in through the bit that allows them to elevate. I don't know what it's called. I'm sorry, I'm not up on military technical terms. You put the guns in, and then you carefully cement the bit on the back, which allows the guns to elevate. If you put too much cement on them, the guns will stick to the front and they won't elevate by hand when you want them to. So I was very, very careful here, and I put only the tiniest bit of cement on, and that unfortunately led to a mistake a bit later on, which I'll tell you about when we come across it. Like I said, learn from my mistakes. In this case, I put too little cement on. Pretty much completed the two separate parts now, and I'm just getting ready for spraying, just checking over to make sure there's no burrs and all the seams there, and if anything needs filling, because this is the stage where I should be doing the filling. Now added all the little bits like the hatch covers and things like that I think are going to be the same colour as the body and the turret. I'm just double checking the instructions to make sure that I've got everything before I start to spray. And again, I will do one final check to make sure I haven't got any gaps to fill and sand. Then I'm going to start painting the wheels and tyres, because once I've sprayed it, I'm going to start assembling the wheels and tyres. So I always like to paint those on the sprue, because it makes it a lot easier rather than trying to paint behind them when they're assembled, or hold them when they're tiny fiddly little parts. Tyres, wheels, things like that, I always paint on the sprue. This is exactly what I mean about double checking. I thought everything was ready to be painted at this point, and yet I went and decided to check the instructions a final time, and I found even more bits that should be added to the turret before painting. I do it all the time, and even I say check and double check and treble check, and even checking that often, I still come across bits that I should have done at the start, which is what I've done here. We come to what I think is my favourite part of scale modelling and making models, and that's the spray booth time. Putting in the spray booth and putting those coats of paint on it. I first started spraying my models maybe back in 1990 because for one Christmas I treated myself to a Tamiya Sprayworks compressor outfit, which was a basic, very basic single action airbrush, a compressor which was powered by a 7.2 volt battery. And I absolutely loved it. I thought I was quite good by painting by hand, but once I got this little Sprayworks compressor kit, I was very impressed with the results. But over the years, I've changed my kit. I've probably still got that Tamiya kit somewhere in the loft, but right now, today, I use a 50 psi compressor with a 3 litre air tank on it, because the one thing I did find with continuous pressure compressors is that as you put demand on them, the actual PSI at the nozzle drops, but with an air tank you can maintain the PSI. I've also got a range of airbrushes now. I have single action and dual action airbrushes. Single action I tend to use for putting on the base coat, the primer coat. What a single action airbrush does is when you pull the trigger, it controls both the air and the flow. So the more you pull the trigger back, the faster the air comes out, the faster the paint comes out. What a dual action airbrush does is it controls the air and the paint flow separately. So you push down on the button to release the airflow. The further you push down, the more air you get out. And then you pull back on the lever, the same lever, to release the paint. So if you only want a very fine line at low pressure, you can do it, which you can't do with the single action airbrush. And I tend to use the dual action airbrush for putting the top coat on, because the base coat, the primer coat, is all about coverage. So a single action airbrush is fine. I just want to get the model covered with a nice, even coat of paint to avoid the surface tension issues you get with hand painting. But with the dual action airbrush, I want to get right in on the tiny details. So sometimes I only need a little bit of paint, but I might need it at a high pressure to get into a part that I couldn't normally get into, which is why I love the dual action airbrush. Another note, I only work with acrylics. I used to hand paint with enamels and I used to hate the smell of them and I used to hate cleaning up. Now I only work with acrylics. Absolutely love acrylics. I like Tamiya acrylics, I like Revell acrylics, and I like Vallejo acrylics. My favourite primers are Vallejo, but my favourite paints are Tamiya. I do love the way Tamiya mixes, and this always starts arguments, but I generally thin my paints with water. I do have some rubbing alcohol, isopropanol alcohol, that I can thin them with, but generally I thin my paints with distilled water, and I normally thin them at a ratio of 2 to 1, till they're about the consistency of milk. I use a mixing stick, and you'll see I actually drip it off the stick till it's about the consistency of milk, and that works for me. And the purist will tell you that you shouldn't be mixing them with water. You should use airbrush thinner and things like that. Well, I don't. Water works fine with acrylic paints. Also makes a fantastic clean-up job as well. Anyway, those are my spray booth painting tips. As for spraying itself, well, again, this is my experience. Lots of light little coats. In fact, my first coat of anything, be it primer or top coat, is always a very, very light dusting. If you put your paint on too heavily, what you're going to find is you're going to suffer from runs, which is the biggest problem. Once you start getting paint runs, you can't really get rid of them. But another problem is that the whole point of priming something is to avoid the surface tension issues you get with a brush. When you brush something onto the substrate, it will bubble because of the surface tension between the plastic and the paint. When I'm priming, I don't want that surface tension. So what I do is I put on lots of little light coats. The primer I put on this model, I've got 10 coats that have gone down, and then they're very light coats each time to build up a nice even coat. The same with the top coat. I put it on and I put 12 coats on just to gradually build it up so it's nice, smooth and even. Little light coats, lots of them. Allow them a good 10 minutes to dry in between as well. With this kit, you get two options. You can either have the turret shut and sealed, or you can have it open with the little man looking out on a pair of binoculars. And I debated long and hard about whether I wanted to do the little man. Bear in mind, this is a 1/76 scale kit. So the little man will be about that high. Now, my eyesight isn't what it was 30 years ago. I need glasses now. My hands are old and they're arthritic, and I've got other health problems, which means that I can't really feel the tip of my fingers. So painting very small, delicate things is very hard. But I thought I would give it a go, and I was actually quite pleasantly surprised with the results that I achieved. One of the things that I do like about acrylics that I could never ever manage with enamels was if I get a bit of overpaint, like just here I'm painting a guy's black hat and I actually drifted some across his face, is I can just damp a piece of tissue paper or paper like I use and just quickly wipe it off, and it removes all trace of the paint with no residue at all, making it very easy to paint over again. I'm using a different selection of manufacturers' paints on this model. My favourite, I'll be honest, my favourite is Tamiya paints. I do love working with Tamiya paints. However, with this one, some of the colours that I've only got available in my stash in Humber colours, or in the case of the man's face, the flesh colour, the only one I've got available is a Revell colour, so I'm using that. Again, it's an acrylic. I'm painting the driver on the sprue because it's a lot easier to handle when I've got all that amount of gripping area that I can grip with my hand. If I took the driver off and just left a little bit on the bottom to hold him by, I'd be struggling a bit. So I always find with these little small bits, it's easier to paint them on the sprue, and then afterwards just put a dab of paint where I've trimmed it off of the sprue. This is where I made my biggest mistake. On the side of the vehicle, there's a chain and some tools that have got to be painted. They're only tiny little things, about 1 millimetre in height and about 3-4 millimetres along. And I just couldn't do it. My eyesight's too poor, my hands are too shaky. I've got minimal feeling in my fingertips. I just couldn't do it. And I made mistake after mistake after mistake trying to paint these chains. I even tried clamping it and doing everything. Thin brushes, I couldn't do it. In the end, the only way I could correct it, because it looked awful, was to repaint it again. I didn't spray it, I hand painted it, and I got the colour wrong. Like I said, this is one of my big mistakes. In future, I'll know not to overreach and paint parts that small. Just giving the driver a second coat because the first coat didn't really break the surface tension. What I was saying earlier about spraying, first coat of hand paint didn't really break the surface tension, so I had to give it a second coat to make it look fairly good. Putting gloves and a magnifier on here, it's a 10 times magnifier because I'm going to have another go at the chains and the tools on the side. The reason I'm going to have another go is because I actually repainted it in the wrong colour, so it's got to be painted again regardless. So if I mess it up, I'll have to repaint it. I'm going to repaint it anyway, so let's see if I can get it right this time. No, I couldn't do it. I could not paint those little awkward fiddly bits. So I decided, yes, it was going to go back and be repainted because the paint I had to mix at the ratio of 20:1 between black and the brown to get the desert colour. And I made it too black, as you can see. I put too much black in. So I'm going to repaint it. But at the same time, I also noticed something that I should have spotted earlier. There were a couple of places on the front and back that needed filling. So I thought, as soon as it's going back to be repainted, I'm going to fill it and sand it as well. Another important little tip is that when you painted something and you're sticking it to something else that's been painted, you have to remove the paint from both surfaces that are going to attach to each other. Otherwise, they won't stick. You can put as much cement on as you like, but it won't melt the paint to stick to the paint. It actually needs some base substrate plastic to melt, to stick into, to weld into some other plastic, which is why I'm sanding down the base of the driver and I'm sanding inside the turret to give those two clean surfaces so that they can melt together. Doing the wheels now, which to be honest is the main reason I don't like doing tanks. I find doing wheels and tyres to be an extremely boring and extremely repetitive process. But like I said, what I did do is I saved myself some grief by painting them on the sprue, then removing them and then putting them together, which meant I only had where the little nipple was after I'd filed it off to paint on the wheels once I'd assembled them, which made my job a whole lot easier. I'm just getting off some paint here from the axles and also sanding off the filling that I did earlier. The reason I'm removing the paint from the axles is obviously so I can stick the tyres and the wheels to them, and then just the tidying up of the filling that I did earlier, ready for repainting again. And here's where I made a massive mistake. Well, I didn't make the mistake here, I made it earlier. What I did is I actually welded the top of the car on the body to the body, forgetting, of course, the turret's got to go into it and a clip's got to go underneath to allow the turret to remove, which means I had to separate that cover from the body I'd already painted and cemented. Now, I've got a little magic solution. It's called MEK, methyl ethyl ketone. That does several things. What it is a fantastic solvent. It's got the consistency of water, and it's a very precise solvent. You brush it on two surfaces to be mated. It melts the top layer of each surface and allows them to go together very quickly. It's very, very precise. And more importantly, it's as cheap as chips. It is so much cheaper than cement. The other reason it's good is if you want to separate parts, because if you get the MEK and you just brush it along the seam, it will loosen the seam, and then you can get in there with a scalpel like I have and just pry the pieces apart without bending them or breaking them or leaving too many marks if you've got to separate something. Here's a little tip for you. MEK, cheap as chips. This is also one of my favourite bits of kit. It's a cordless rotary tool, which is rechargeable, USB rechargeable. It only cost me £25, and it comes with a whole range of accessories. I can use it to drill, grind and sand. Here I'm using a sanding stone just to sand down where I filled earlier. The good thing about it is it's got about 8 different speeds, and I can use it on a really low speed without doing any damage, or without fear of doing any real damage to the substrate if I go too mad. Fantastic tool, wouldn't be without it in my model kit. I'm just putting the last bits on now. Now, these are a slightly different colour to the rest of the body. I think they're green camo, or olive drab, if I remember correctly. which is why I've left them till last. Again, that's something I do at the beginning of the model. I look at what things have got to be painted and what order they've got to go on to, and make decisions about whether leaving things on. I'm going to be hand painting this, not spraying it, because I've already done so much work on it to restore it back to its original colour. But I will paint round these bits and then top them off with their original colour, which is why I'm putting them on now. Doing some final double checks, I just happened to notice that the guns on the turret were a bit loose. And I looked at them and I realised that when I'd earlier put the back on the bit of the guns, I hadn't used enough cement and it had fallen off inside the turret. And so the guns were falling out. And there's no way that I could get the turret apart now. I was too far into the build. So all I had to do was cement the guns in place. So I'm afraid the guns no longer elevate. That's the mistake I told you about earlier on that will come back and haunt me later. Right, here we go, the final painting, and to be honest, I've decided that I'm not going to try and mix it to the Revell colour that I said of 20:1 black to brown. I'm just going to paint it the desert brown and have done with it. It's not going to be accurate, it's not going to be precise, but it won't set my OCD off any more than having to repaint it again if I get it wrong. So I've decided that that's going to be straying away from the plan itself. Even though I'm hand painting, you'll notice that I still reduce the volume of the paint with water. Again, I do this at a ratio of about 20% because I find that the paints are too thick and they will clump when you're brush painting. So using water to thin them means that I can give it several lighter coats and it doesn't look like I've put the paint on too thickly and it's not clumping. Just putting the last top coat on now. Like when I spray, I do it in several thin coats. I don't try and cover the model at once with a single coat. Because I'm using a thin down paint, I use several coats. I think this is the second coat that I put on this just to finish it off and make sure that I've got everything. Just touching up the gun barrels and the tyres in flat black where I'd hand painted them originally, and I'd noticed again that there was some surface tension issues when I'd given it just one coat, so I'm just going over them with a second coat just to make sure there's no uneven coverage. And that's it, we're done. Well, as done as you're going to see, because unfortunately, as I got to this stage in making the model, I became ill and I had to be rushed off into hospital to have emergency surgery to have my gallbladder out. So I never managed to get the filming of the final part. However, I've gone back and I've refilmed it once it's been done just to show you what it looks like done. Well, there you are. That's about as done as it's going to get done. When you consider this is my second practice model, it's a very small scale after something like approaching 30 years away from modelling. It's not too bad a job. When I look at it up close like this in 4K, which is how I filmed it, I can see lots of issues with it and lots of things I could have done a bit better. But that's the beauty of making it. Practice makes perfect, and it's given me the confidence to tackle a much larger model, which I will do in my next kit build, which will be a 1/12 scale. Overall, though, I'm happy. It's practice. Nobody's going to be perfect making models. I mean, some of these guys that make the most perfect models in the world, they've been doing it continuously for 20, 30 years, and they've got hundreds of models behind them. As I say, after a long, long break, this is only my second one, and it was originally designed as practice right from the beginning. Anyway, hope to see you for my next model build, which I think is going to be a Tamiya 1/12 scale VX 1100 Virago motorbike. I love building motorbikes.